Welcome to Bridging Chicago, a podcast that aims to connect our listeners to Chicago's business, community, cultural, and charity leaders.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Bridging Chicago podcast. I'm Nathan, your host for today's episode, and I'm really excited to be joined by Dan Futrell, the founder of Polymath University. And Dan, when we started talking about what you're doing, it was so interesting because, one, you're obviously very passionate about it, and we meet people like that all the time. But it's something where it's so innovative that that I think if it works, it's going to work really well. And I think it could actually become more the thing that people connect with. I don't know about the standard, because you never know how the standards are going to change over time. But the concept of Polymath University is really interesting. And I think I connected with it right away, and I think other people will too. So I'm really excited to learn about that and learn about what sort of made you want to create something different. But we are Bridging Chicago, and so we always start with your Chicago story. So that's where we're going to start. So if you could share with us about what brought you to Chicago, or about what, or if you grew up here, what you know about it and what you love about the city.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. Really appreciate it. Moved to Chicago in 2019.
Okay.
So I grew up in California, was living in Boston at the time, and I was selected. I served 5 years in the Army, went back to get a degree, and was selected as a Pat Tillman Scholar. And the Pat Tillman Foundation is located here in Chicago.
Oh, okay.
And so I was selected here in the Loop, actually, out in LaSalle. And I was selected as a Tillman Scholar in 2011. And every summer in July, they have a Pat Tillman Leadership Summit here in Chicago. And so I had been coming every summer for that for a number of years, and started my career in the nonprofit and educational space. In 2019, they invited me to serve as CEO of the Pat Tillman Foundation.
Wow.
And so I moved from Boston with my wife to Chicago, came in and got to get a good winter under my belt, and and get in the pandemic, and now we're raising two little kids here just north of Evanston.
Wow. So the pandemic and winter all at once had to be interesting to navigate. When you first moved here, what was it about the city that you noticed, about the people, or even like the Midwestern culture, that you really noticed that may have been different than what you've experienced in the past?
Yeah. Well, everybody talks about the West Coast as having a vibe to it.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Silicon Valley, like almost before or as it was becoming Silicon Valley.
Okay.
And then Boston has its, and the East Coast has a feel to it. I remember when I moved from, I served in the Army in Washington State. Moving to Boston, people said, "Oh, watch out! People aren't very nice in Boston."
Mm.
I was like, "Oh, okay, that's interesting. Let me see." If you're driving on 90, perhaps people aren't very nice in Boston. But coming here, so everything I heard about what is Chicago, I was hearing it first in Boston. And people would say, "Oh, people are so friendly. People will stop and say hi on the street." Once I got here and talked to some of my coworkers, they would say, "Oh, Chicago is a very charitable, a very philanthropic town."
Yeah.
And I found that to be true. Chicago's been really great. So appreciate being here for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
Growing up in California, I didn't realize I'd never been to a Great Lake before, so I didn't realize that the beaches had sand. It's just something I had never thought about before. But definitely appreciate being here, and we're still feel like we're learning the city and the surroundings.
Yeah, it definitely is a city. It is a very dynamic city. It changes a lot. We've had some more mild winters lately, which we've been very lucky about. Well, I don't know, maybe global warming, not a great thing, but it does give us a little more mild winter. So it's a city that I think is really fun to explore, to get to know, to make your home, and hopefully for the kids that they've settled in as well.
Yeah.
So what experiences in the past? I mean, the military, they always say the military is the best leadership training you can get out there. But what experience and training in the past do you have that made you feel ready to take on as CEO? CEO is a big thing. It's a big title and a big job. And so when you first came here, what do you feel like you had learned in the past that made you ready for that job?
Yeah. One advantage I think I had coming in was, as a Tillman Scholar. At the time, there were about 600 Tillman Scholars across the country. And just for the audience, every year 60 Tillman Scholars are selected,
Okay.
All veterans and military spouses, to go back to school. I had been a scholar for 8 years at the time, and so I knew the community quite well, both the scholar community, but also the staff. When I started, it was about a 12-person staff. And so it didn't feel like I was entering into an organization that was unfamiliar to me. So I think that was beneficial. The other, I think kind of leadership piece is, I learned early on in the Army that that it's never going to serve you if you try to be an image of a thing, like in a role, right?
Okay.
It's like, oh, well, here's, I've never been CEO before. Well, here's what I think that means. I'm going to now try to be that, which is a different approach than here's who I am.
Yeah.
And now I'm being called to do a list of things and support people in a different way. Those are two slightly different approaches to the role. And I learned that very early on, serving in Baghdad, from, non-commissioned officers who helped me to do better than I was doing at the time. And so I think that served me well, and I think it still continues to serve me.
Yeah, I think especially it's obviously very important work, and we definitely thank you for your service and the people that you work alongside, because I noticed that when I was looking at Polymath, I noticed there were a lot of veterans on that board and staff as well. And so obviously it's very important. And I'm thinking about, like, as you're learning these lessons, and as, I think CEO can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different organizations, but for us, for something like the Tillman Scholarship, where I assume that family, the Tillman family, still has it's very important to them, and it's very important for the people that are chosen to work with the organization. But what do you know about the family and about their connection with that and the scholarship still? That is very important, and that really is written into the way that you work and what you do. I assume it still has a deep, meaningful connection with that. Yeah.
Well, the Pat Tillman Foundation was started by Marie Tillman and friends and family after Pat was killed in 2004. And Marie is still the board chair, still leads the organization. And so it meant quite a lot to me for her to invite me to lead in that way.
Yeah.
And, for her, she didn't have to do that. She doesn't have to still be involved with it, when I was there 16, 17, 18, 19 years later. And so yes, she was, because not only was she, keeping Pat's name and story alive, but she was supporting a community of, leaders who were trying to do big things in the world.
Yeah.
And that, meant a lot to her. And her family, right? She remarried here in Chicago, and there are friends and family of Pat through different stages of Pat's life that were involved with the foundation, that are still a part of it. And you mentioned Tillman Scholars being a part of Polymath University. That community and that draw to service and that draw to impact is so strong that, of course, that's the group that I would look to to find Tillman Scholars who care about education. And our advisory board, out of 10 people, 9 of them are Tillman Scholars who have or are working towards PhDs with the benefit of support of the Pat Tillman Foundation. And so this is kind of a continuation of that story.
Yeah. Education as a resource is obviously really important, and I think we would all agree that education is one of our greatest resources. But for you, what does it mean to be able to be a part of educating people? Because I think, I guess we can start with kind of 2 questions in that, like your desire to start something that would educate people, and then sort of the way that you do it in providing resources to people as you're bringing them in to learn. And we'll talk about how you're doing that a little bit, but just like kind of the why. What was so in you that was so passionate about starting this?
Yeah. I grew up partially in foster care and partially raised by a single dad who last year finished 49 years working in a factory, making housing insulation in California. The plant that he worked at shut down. It was built right after World War II. It shut down because the land is so valuable now as something other than a insulation factory.
Yeah.
But, I grew up with my dad working rotating shifts, day shifts, swing shifts, graveyard, repeat. And my dad, he dropped out of high school and eventually got a GED, and later in life, started attending community college a little bit. But he's somebody who just made it so, just emphasized so much how important education was to creating a better opportunity. Yeah. And so he made a big deal of it. And, he put me in a private school when I was younger and supported me through that in all sorts of ways, when he didn't have to, and he didn't have a lot. We didn't have a lot. And so, I was able to go to college on an ROTC scholarship, and, in exchange, I signed up 6 days before September 11, actually.
Wow.
In exchange, I served for 5 years in the Army. I guess the deal was 4. I did an extra 5. I spent nearly half of that in Baghdad, deployed, and I gained a ton from that. But if that's our best answer for how you afford college, something is wrong. Something is wrong. And when you look at, every year since 2010, enrollment in college across the country has decreased. At the same time, tuition has increased by 40%. What a dysfunctional market. That less people want the thing, and so we're going to keep charging more for it. Yeah. And on top of that, they did a survey. They said chief academic officers, this is the person who's responsible for education at a university, 96% of them say that their graduates are ready for the workforce. They're ready for their jobs. Well, they asked the same question of hiring managers. Only 11% of hiring managers say that their recent college grad hires were ready for their job. Oh. That gap is so large that a lot of people now, a lot of young adults, a lot of families are deciding that either the ROI isn't worth it to go to college, or it's not effective enough for them to do. It just costs too much, and that to me is a loss. I went to, not very religious, but went to a Jesuit university, focused on educating the whole person. And if our answer to runaway cost for higher ed is a 6-month boot camp to learn how to code or something, we will have lost a lot of humanity in that. And that seems a shame. So in my eyes, higher ed's not doing it. They're not coming up with a better answer. There's really no other choice than to try to start something and provide a better option. Yeah,
it's a great point. And I think that, it's hard because you think about, okay, well, what should they be doing? Like you said, higher ed isn't doing it. So what should they be doing? And when you think about the fact that tuition's rising and less people are even wanting to go or feeling the need to go, I think that is really interesting. But what's the concept that you came up with then out of this to say, like, okay, what is there is not working, and I see that people are not ready to step into the job day one and feel confident about their ability to do what they need to do, or their employers feeling that confidence anyway. And so kind of out of that, what became Polymath University in the beginning stages of just conceptualizing what higher ed might look like if you could reimagine it a little bit?
Yeah. There's 3 parts to Polymath University. It's interdisciplinary, it's apprenticeship based, and it's remote learning, and really delivered in a hybrid model. The interdisciplinary part, that comes from Dr. David Staley, a professor at Ohio State University, who wrote a book called Alternative Universities. Okay. He came up with the core academic structure of Polymath University, whereby students pursue 3 different majors, non-adjacent majors at the same time. So you remove all the electives, you reduce the core, and reallocate 120 credits to pursue 3 majors at the same time. Okay. People who are listening might understand that it sounds kind of like a liberal arts degree, right? It's meant to be broad. The problem with a traditional liberal arts degree is, you take one class in one thing as an elective, doesn't actually give you enough knowledge to be well versed in that. So we're rearranging things so you can go deep in 3 different majors. That's the interdisciplinary part. And there's a ton of science that shows that people who do that, who build that depth of knowledge, are more creative and better able to solve complex problems.
Okay.
That's one. The second piece is apprenticeship based. And we're talking about like knowledge economy apprenticeships, which have doubled over the last 15 years across the country. So employers are starting to understand even more that, if you have roles that are hard to find, hard to fill, you could build your own talent pipeline by building or embracing an apprenticeship model. In our model, in a 3-year, year-round degree program, students in years 2 and 3 will be concurrently pursuing 2 classes at a time while working as an apprentice with an employer partner.
Okay.
And then the last piece is, a remote delivery, a hybrid model. 1 week per semester is in person, but more importantly, we're building our cohorts in the same city. So we're going to launch in Chicago and probably Burlington, Vermont, an urban and a rural location. What that means really is, instead of sitting in an online class where there's somebody else on screen in Atlanta and Seattle that I'm never going to meet, you gotta we're going to start with 100 students here in Chicago. We have 100 students in Chicago, so I could take class on my laptop, get on the L, and go to a study group to prepare for the thing next week. Build my social and professional network, which is part of the residential experience. You don't have to pay as much though to get that, and so we're building that into it. So that's our model for Polymath University.
Does the 3 majors, the interdisciplinary concept, does that get overwhelming for students, or do you feel like they're like, how do you manage that so that a student doesn't? Because I think when you have one major, it makes you feel like, okay, I'm going to really like study on this. And I know that you mentioned taking away the electives, which I think is great because we all know that spending 1.5 years on electives is like kind of crazy. But this 3-track concept of 3 majors, how do you keep that from being overwhelming for students, or for them saying like, okay, I can't focus in on doing really one thing, really, or learning a lot about this one area?
Yeah. So I'll answer in 2 ways. First, we haven't started yet, right? We're still in build mode. So, the undergraduate program we expect to start in 2028.
Okay.
Next fall, we're starting a 1-year certificate program called the Polymath Fellowship, where we'll start to see that. Second piece of my answer, being a polymath is about breadth, depth, and integration. And the 3 majors provide the breadth and the depth. And that's something that somebody has to pursue over a lifetime, right? That takes a long time. Sure. Especially if we want to throw around this term about lifelong learning. The integration piece is the part that matters most, right? So it's not, so will it be overwhelming? Well, I don't know. Let's figure that out. Right? We need to be open to hearing that. But we think that the value that you gain from being, fluent in multiple different areas, and importantly, you gain the skill of integrating across those disciplines. Like, people used to go to university because it was the place where you got knowledge. Like that's where the knowledge lived. The professors are there, the research is there. I want knowledge. I go to school, right? Right. Nowadays, we all have all of human knowledge in our pockets. We have AI, is giving us information like that even better than Google has been, right? So university isn't a place where you go to for knowledge. Instead, with all this knowledge right at our fingertips, the skill that's going to matter the most in the next 5, 10, 15 years is the ability to connect the dots across pieces of knowledge, to be able to identify, hey, this thing actually is not relevant to the problem I'm trying to solve right now. I need to go over here and connect across the different disciplines. Sure. Like, think about climate change, right? If you're somebody who wants to solve climate change, you need to know material science, environmental science. Depending on what you're working on, geology, diplomacy, international trade, behavioral science, psychology, and all sorts of things need to come together just to figure out what are the right kind of solar panels we need, and how do we get people to buy them, and what policy intervention is going to get people to do that. Like, that's a problem that's so complex that, we don't need people working. We still need specialists, of course. But we think at Polymath University that the skill that's going to be more prized in the next 10 years, that is today undervalued, is the ability to connect the dots across disciplines.
And you mentioned about, these three majors, and it's a lifelong thing. It's not you're learning every single thing that you're ever going to need to know right now, but it's over the period of your life. And I think that what's really interesting to me in that is you look at university and you think like, okay, this place is going to teach me everything that I need to know so that I can go and start doing my job and getting paid to do what I'm going to do for my life. That's what a lot, most people would hope. And obviously we know a lot of people end up getting jobs in areas that they didn't major in or changing their majors throughout time. But when you start, I think you hope that, that you're going to learn what you need to know in order to do the work. And what really intrigued me about your concept is that you're kind of like saying, no, you're not going to do that here. You're not going to come here and learn every single thing you need to know. You're not going to come here and get, learn all the knowledge that everyone has. But what you're going to learn is how to work a little more and learn how to work in teams and in social situations and across academic situations so that you feel a little more equipped, because day one, I think that's what you're doing. You're learning about who you're going to do this work with and sort of what else you need to know. Because I know when I've been training people, it's like, well, it's great that you went to that school and now you have some legal degree, but you need to know how the law actually works in real time, in reality, because if you just try and do it that way, it's never going to work for you. Yeah.
The idea that students go to school and sit in a classroom for 4 years and they come out and they're ready to hit the ground running, I think that's an idea for maybe the 60s or 70s, right? Not now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why we built the apprenticeship model into our approach. That is not only a business model for us, but it's also applied learning for the student.
Yeah.
So that you don't show up to your first job and say, oh, this is the first time that I've seen this thing done in real life. Instead, those nuances that but that somebody coming straight out of law school doesn't, is like, oh no, here's actually how we apply that.
Yeah,
here's how we do it. I'll tell you. The other thing that highlights too for me though is how separate industry is from academia.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
mm-hmm.
We had the way traditional universities are structured, where you have to research, publish, speak at conferences and whatnot in order to get tenure. Like the structure is built to separate you from the world.
Yeah.
Right, and to keep you in academia. That doesn't serve people very well. The last thing I'll say too is that they there's a study that was done some time ago that looked at how our brains function with regard to remembering things, remembering facts and details and whatnot, to know a concept. And this is largely in our memory. Said our brains over the last 20 years have actually changed a little bit, such that we are more likely to remember the path to find a piece of information, rather than remember the information itself.
Okay.
So it's like, oh, I'm more likely to remember what do I search for in Google to get that information than actually just retain that information. And what we're doing, however you might feel about that, like we still need to know stuff, of course.
Sure.
But we're building an educational model that helps people ideally gain the tools to go find and build the answer to complex problems, because the world is so much more dynamic today, and interconnected with technology.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I know that you mentioned that your first undergraduate class is a few years away. How can people connect with you today? And if people are interested in what you've shared or this concept, how can they learn more about Polymath?
Yeah, thanks for that. So polymathu.org, just the letter U, like university. Polymathu.org is our website. Please go there, check it out. That's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is, again, we are launching with a 1-year certificate program. We're calling it an innovation certificate, the Polymath Fellowship. And this is for early career folks who otherwise might be pursuing a certificate in organizational leadership or systems thinking or human-centered design. We're trying to help people connect the dots across functions and teams and do it in a way where they can collaborate with others, right? There's a leadership element to this too, and we bring our military experience into that. Please go to the website, check out the Polymath Fellowship. It's for folks who are, let's say, 10 years after their bachelor's degree, within the first 10 years after their bachelor's degree. And we think, it'll have it'll help people level up in their impact.
Yeah. And then I'm assuming you'll take what you learn there and kind of apply it to this undergrad program as you learn more and
absolutely
build that out.
Yeah. So, I mean, from a launch university standpoint, when you look at the universities that have started in the last 25 years, not a lot of them, but for those that have, they've often started with a 1-year program and iterated a little bit more quickly to see like, oh, what do we get right? What do we need to adjust? How does the world respond to our program? And so we're pursuing that approach as well.
Sounds great. Well, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah.
It's been really interesting learning more, and I'm sure that people are going to visit polymathu.org to learn more and to see how they can connect with you. So we want to thank you, Dan, and thank you, of course, for tuning into this episode of the Bridging Chicago podcast. Be sure to visit our website, www.bridgingchicago.com, to watch all of the current season's episodes as well as our past seasons as well. There are 6 seasons up there for you to view, and you can learn more about Polymath U on there as well. So thanks again, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Bridging Chicago podcast.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Bridging Chicago, as produced by the SATC Solutions Center. Nothing contained in this podcast shall constitute financial, investment, legal, and/or professional advice. No professional relationship of any kind is created between you and the podcast host or guest. You are urged to speak with your financial, investment, or legal advisors before making any investment or legal decisions. Furthermore, the opinions expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the opinions of SATC Solutions Center, SATC Law, or any of its employees. This podcast is created by the hosts and guests' individual capacities. All opinions on this podcast are or have been rendered based on specific facts, under certain conditions, and are subject to certain assumptions and may not and should not be used or relied upon for any other purpose, including, but not limited to, or use in or in connection with any investment purposes or legal proceeding.